right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, I have with me Puja. Puja, thank you for talking with me.
Thank you for having me.
So, I just last week you had sent me your paper on PCARE, which
Mhm.
is I'm not going to attempt to pretend I know what the acronym stands for. Um,
Community Asset Resource Exchange.
yes. And it's in general, it's kind of like a community currency protocol, I would say.
It
But
is it is a community currency. It is a design for a community currency.
okay, so curious, I mean, what made you go down this route to creating a community currency and yeah, I guess why did you kind of get into this?
Sure. So there are a lot of questions that we're facing today, and they actually all are different aspects of the same problem. So there's one crisis right now that we have in governance between uh, one form of governance, like democratic governance, versus corporate governance, right? And it's two different models for uh, governing AI networks and global networks. And like both of these systems have their flaws. And in the start of the paper, I actually launch into the shortcomings of both of these systems, and they both have aspects of overreach and capture. That's like one set of problems. Another set of problems that's related is how do we actually express decentralized identity? And this is important for governance in, protocols and networks. And if you're in crypto, you're familiar with this problem and like, how if you don't have any sort of identity primitives, then it just sort of ends in capture and overreach as well, right? And then there's like another set of problems around we have these like financial systems and non-financial systems, and they interact and collide in different ways. And so, and money is sort of the classic, expression of a financial system, and votes are an expression of a non-financial system. And in democratic capture and overreach, this happens when money undermines votes, or maybe votes become too expressive. And the reverse is true also for corporate governance, where votes can also undermine, the functions of money, or money can just go too far, right, and create externalities. So we're in this age of a lot of conflicts, and how do we navigate that? Another really important conflict is just between public and private. So we have private goods, we have public goods, and we're kind of entering in this weird situation where like private goods are sort of starting to be treated like public goods, and public goods are treating like private goods. And the reality is most goods are somewhere in between public and private, right? And so the point of this paper was to actually address all of these tensions. Actually, it wasn't intended to address all of them, but it sort of ended up doing that because when you start to think about goods in between the spectrum of private and public, and you design systems to capture the economic realities of that, right? And you build systems to try to encourage growth and economic growth and productivity based off of this economic reality. It has spillover effects to how you think about governance and striking a third way between democratic and corporate, for example, or how you think about, identity and how do you enforce, deal with this enforcement problem in identity, and how you think about the intersection of non-financial and financial systems. So that was like the big sort of, mega overarching, tensions that were in my mind as I was writing this paper.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I'll obviously link to the paper if nobody's looking at this, but it's obviously a very long paper given the breadth of the topics that you're kind of discussing. But that's like the reason I asked about it being a community currency is just like most of the times when I think of a community currency, you usually think like a locality, right? So I live here in Frederick, Maryland. We would say start a local community currency for our town, and it would keep everything in. But it seemed like this was more about you could use your system in a way as like a pseudo equity or a pseudo um, DAO governance token or something like that versus say the traditional community currency aspect of it, or would you disagree?
I think you can. So, community currencies, I emphasize the community local part of it because in order to build systems that do not end in centralized surveillance, winner take all, or global oligopoly, you need to have some subsidiarity and you need to have bottom up adaptive systems. And so I'm trying to think of a system that meets a certain set of requirements, right? That doesn't end in surveillance, that doesn't end in monopoly, that is adaptive, that is flexible, that helps us overcome limitations to economic growth and, get us beyond, just social media and, 140 characters and so on. And you have to think, not just about global currencies like Bitcoin or fiat currencies, but also community currencies that they play an essential information function in producing and allocating capital and economic goods, and that's been overlooked. And so I think it's just we're entering an age now where there's going to be a lot of kind of currency wars, and people are going to be questioning the legitimacy of currencies. I think we already are there. And so the question is, how do we build legitimate currencies that reflect value, that are accountable, that can form a substrate even for, say, deploying AI agents that represent your interests and just don't get exploited, right? Or exploit you. And in order to do that, you need to just represent the richness of value, and community currencies are critical to that. And they've been overlooked, because there hasn't been a really easy and clean way to express them in an incentive compatible way. So that's why I start with community currencies. But the reality is community currencies nest into broader currencies, which nest into network currencies. And what I'm really imagining is a world of like networked currencies interoperating with each other, being traded, and ultimately being a form of communication, right? And serving information functions in the same way prices serve an information function. This is kind of an extension of, Hayek's work on the information function of prices, but just applied to goods that are not purely private or purely public, and, opening this new possibility space between private and public, and enabling much richer social coordination as a result of that. That was a mouthful.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know where I want you to dig into more. I guess that last point, can you give an example for me? Like what's like a private versus public good? Like what's one that's kind of in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually everything is. So
Right.
that's like
Yeah,
the
I know
radical
what you
view.
mean, but I kind of want you to have to.
So like so let's take like a private good that's like food, right? If I don't eat well, if I just eat garbage, right? My family suffers because I'm grumpy. I have like sugar highs and lows, right? I'm not like as well socially or emotionally regulated, like, um, and so me eating well is actually a shared good for my family. Me sleeping well too is also really important for my family, right? It's not something that just impacts me. And when I feel good, when I feel good, my family feels good. And when my family feels good, I feel good. And there's this nice feedback between, right? So we're a shared unit, right? And the same thing is true for a lot of things, water, clean air. Um, Even music. Music is a great example of something that's like not totally private or public. And I emphasize this point because I feel like a lot of people are just wondering like why music has declined so much. Like really good music. We kind of are in this like weird.
We'll have
I
to
don't
have a debate on this, but I
know.
think
Oh, you think music is better now? I mean, I don't know. Like I think after 90s rap, it was just all downhill. But I'm a big fan of gangster rap. Um, but like yeah, I mean, they're and let's take the other extreme, like even public goods, right? So people say like parks are an example, but the reality is like parks, are limited by geographic access.
right.
It's right, and like even lighthouses, right? The classic example, like these are not totally public goods. And in fact, it's really hard to think of a good which benefits everybody universally in the same way, equally. And that's really important. So like in the conception of public goods, people are like, oh, well, this is something that's like non-excludable, non-rivalrous. Um, but most goods are neither totally non-excludable or not totally rivalrous, but also they benefit people in different degrees, right? And we care
Maybe
about
like
them.
the asteroid coming to hit and destroy the Earth.
Maybe, yeah, yeah. Okay, then when we all
Yes.
blow up, right, we all blow up equally, right?
Yes.
Exactly. Like apart from that, like
Yeah.
that's just not a reflection of economic reality. And a lot of the kind of systems that we've built, right, are coming into conflict because we have these like artificial distinctions, right? And so like corporate governance and corporations, they deliver, very efficient at delivering apples and widgets and whatever, works great. But now, we're kind of in the era of social networks and they cross geographic boundaries and the externalities can't really be contained by democratic governments or other kinds of governments. They just extend beyond the nation state, right? Um, and that's a problem. How do you because a set of people who have influence over that over networks are not the set of people who are impacted by them, right? Um, and so how do you actually govern that is a big question. And that's something also that's like not a private good or not really a public good. It's a networked good. So anyways, that's my answer. Another long-winded answer
Yes.
to your question.
Well, to kind of explain, correct me if I'm wrong, like how PCARE works would be, you create a community currency for your, say, your neighborhood, and you have, is there a set limit that you mint, or it's just you mint some tokens?
Yeah, so the idea is that you have some association set, some set of people who are in your community, right? And you issue a currency to that like initial set, and people they can decide how much to stake irrevocably,
Yep.
um, and whatever they stake irrevocably will determine their influence or their voting power. And of course, I'm a big fan of quadratic staking, funding, and voting. So put a square root on that. So as people accumulate more influence, there's a trade-off that's diminishing returns to more influence. Um, and the currency which they don't stake, they get to keep as a transferable token. And they use that transferable token to get access to other community goods. And so it becomes like a tradable currency with like supply and demand, right? And communities can also uh, stipulate certain rules of use and access and
So the community should sell,
community.
you should have people be selling things for that currency.
Well, I think like a lot of communities. So, like an example is like a community has a fishery, they have a ski slope. How do you manage access to that resource, right? And govern that resource. They could issue community currency if you wanted to access that resource. You have to buy it, from outside and then spend it to access the resource. Now, say you like that resource so much, then you can buy currency and then stake it for influence, right? And what I'm saying is that's like the basic sort of structure, but there's a lot of more nuance that communities can like they can make communities currencies very bespoke. They can say, limit the set of participants who could even buy the currency based off of their social proximity, right? They could tax. They could charge, higher prices for people who are farther away. They could also take more there's a spectrum of like financialization to like non-financialization. It could, the community currency or access to it or getting it could be a function of just how much time you spend. Like if you go to church, right? A church is a community. And that's like a non-financialized interaction, right? And some people might be like, well, why would you want to, put numbers and quantities on this? Well, it's like, well, to actually make transparent the organization that you're entering into, because some churches are real scammy churches, so,
Sure.
this actually makes explicit, okay, how are people, buying influence and trading attention? And it also enables like, networks of churches. But like other communities might just be much more financialized and say, you know what, we're going to just auction off periodically a set of tokens and we're a financialized community and there's no restrictions on who can come in and, and anyone can stake. And then there's
Guessing you would
communities.
recommend against this, but
Well, it depends what kind of community you are. Like, I just think they're like, I'm just enabling like a substrate for, I think that non-financialized communities are very important. Like family is a non-financialized community. No one's going to sell off grandma, right? Um,
Well, would
so
you
nobody,
say that this is financializing in some sense, the non-financialized community?
I think it just makes explicit the non-financialized relationships. So like time banking, right, is an example of let's
Yep.
use time as a resource. And like for communities that don't have, access to expensive global currency, time banking, time becomes like a currency for them. And being able just enabling them to use, if they want to do that, let them do that. And let's create like coordination mechanisms that let them, flourish. I'm agnostic about, how communities, uh, on the spectrum of financialization to non-financialization, they're just very different animals for very different groups. Some groups might, like a open source software community, might, you know, uh, use dominant assurance contracts, which is like something in between, where to be a member of the community, you have to put something down first as like a guarantee, and then if you succeed, then you get this big payout, right? And maybe open source software developer communities, that's like more,
They seem
incentive
to be
component.
like the hyper rational group, I guess you could say.
Yeah, like they would love that. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
Alice Tabarrok would love the dominant assurance contracts community. But a big point, which I have not mentioned, in the community PCARE design is so you as a community member make a choice between irrevocably staking for influence and having transferable tokens for communication, right? But as a member of a community, you are coordinating around a shared good. That shared good generates value and benefits, which come back to you in the form of a community-based income. And so at every interval of this like community-based income that comes back to you, right, you are making a choice between how much you stake for more influence versus how much you keep as currency to like use to trade with other communities and access their goods. And so what ends up happening is you have this really nice market mechanism of deciding which plural goods matter to you the most and which are relevant to you. And you don't entirely exit your old communities. You can slowly taper off, right? And say I get bored by my participation in a community that, manages some good, like say like a ski slope or something. And I become more interested in like the lake community and influencing that because I take up swimming, right? I will slowly, as I get community-based income, be staking more for more influence in the swimming community or access to like the lake. Um, and over time, my influence will decline in this other community, but I'm not entirely ever untethered from it. And there's always that history, right? And those set of histories, that kind of constitutes our identity, right? Our participation across many communities and our degree of commitment across many communities form a constellation that individuate us as human beings based off of what we value and fundamentally who we're communicating with, because these community currencies really are just communication currencies.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess one technical question that keeps popping up, like how do you prevent the restaking aspect of it? Like it reminds me of like the curve design. So if you're staking,
Mhm.
you get a vote on the who gets the inflationary rewards if you're staking. And then what happens is now there's a convex token, which is just basically holds 100% of all of the stakes, and everybody's just always staked. And then you just trade around the wrapped, staked token. Or would this just be like this is too crypto, bro? That we're
No, no, no. I think like you have to. I have like a footnote about credit and like
okay.
imagining an entirely different credit system from this that is much more expansive. I like thinking about credit. I think credit is good. It's what makes, you know, the world go around. We don't want a world where we don't have credit. Leverage is very tricky though. Um, so can you restake? Your question is, can you restake?
Or like a liquid staking token, on
Not
top of.
really. I mean, when you have influence, in a community, you irrevocably stake it, and that gives you your voting power. And then the question is, well, can you delegate that, right, to some other, uh, right?
Well, not even like could I
It's to
have like
restake.
almost like could you like mint a stable coin that's backed by your staked PCARE tokens? So then you get some transferability rights, but then you're still holding on to the governance piece.
I mean, you could like, so a big part of this paper is emphasizing the importance of subsidiarity and having more local power than global power. It's like the key to making all this work and not ending in some like centralized surveillance or some like highly leveraged system that ends in collapse, right? Like
I mean, I
catastrophic.
think this is like in a lot of your readings. Maybe you can expand on that a bit because like
Yeah.
basically like everything gets captured. Like
Yeah, I mean, I start the paper talking about capture, right? I
yeah.
say these are the capture vectors for democratic governance and for corporate governance. What I'm saying about subsidiarity is communities like if I if I say, okay, look, I have this stake, I have this influence, and I'm going to create another contract and a token and then trade that token for influence. What you're actually doing is undermining the you're you're auctioning off your influence and you're violating the influence rules of the community, and that will be policed. Like that should be policed by communities. Like if I go and I'm making, that's basically essentially a form of like bribing and creating a channel of influence for bribes. And communities have to enforce, there's no way around that. They have to um, enforce against that. And so like this happens in corporate governance. It's called empty voting. It's a very obscure phenomena. I studied it like when it first came out, like in like 2006, I think was the first paper written about it. I don't think another paper has actually been written about it. And I actually studied it in like 2008 when I was like a securities lawyer. And it's just not incentive compatible at all, right? Like what happens is you when you buy shares in a company, it's one share, one vote. And what you can do is, buy puts or derivatives and offset your economic interests. So that goes to like zero. And then you still have this voting interest. And so say there's like an M&A deal, you can also have another interest in another company and you want that company to win and say you would disproportionately benefit if that company won that M&A deal, then you can use your influence in company A, right? And vote to the detriment of that company in order to increase the odds of company B winning where you have disproportionate gains, right? And that's just in that scenario you're not tied to the rise and fall of shareholder value. You're actually untethering yourself from that, and that breaks the fundamental tenets of corporate governance. You should have skin in the game, right?
Right.
Like if I make an investment in a company, like I shouldn't be able to kind of unwind that investment and vote to that company's detriment and help competitors. It's dishonest, right? And it's not fair to the other shareholders. It's not fair to the founders. Um, and it's not good for capital markets. And so like, yeah, I think empty voting is a bad thing. I think other people are like, oh, we don't know if it's good or bad. I'm like, no, it's bad. And the same, phenomena happens in DAOs. It could happen in community currencies, and that's why you need enforcement, an enforcement mechanism. And that's why, in the paper, I first introduced this idea of capture and overreach and the failures of democratic and corporate governance. The second section, I outlined the basics of the model. And then the third section, I just go super hard on the enforcement question, because if you can't enforce, these rules of influence, if I can just like, create another channel of influence and auction off my influence in a community to some other set of participants, then that's not good. That being said, however, like I just want to put a caveat there, like you should be able to like delegate, and the community currencies enable really interesting forms of delegation that are actually, I think, more accountable. So, you can have within a community a coalition that emerges, and like say you, me, and somebody else, Bob, we're just like, let's take let's form a new coalition and let's stake our transferable currency in that coalition, and form kind of like a subgroup within the community, and this subgroup will kind of represent our interests, right? And that's like really interesting. And then like that can kind of like keep going on, and you can like put in, AI agents there that that are proportional, the biases, the weights in each AI agent is proportional to the stake each participant contributes into this coalition agent. And it kind of draws from our own even personal AIs and the other community AIs to form like a composite that represents the coalition's general interest. So there's like really cool stuff that you can do there. I don't want to like go off on that tangent.
Yeah. No,
But
I mean,
I
I
just
wanted to
want,
go more back to the enforcement piece.
okay, yeah,
Like I feel like a lot of times, like I went down like the prediction market rabbit hole a while ago, and you
yeah,
had like handling bribes and settlement of those is always really important, and it's really really hard to do without some sort of social layer. Um,
yes.
but like even then, like what always caught me was that bribes in real governance looked way different than like bribes in theoretical prediction market land where you're like just trying to like steal the pot of money. Like in general, like bribes are like, like the example I can bring up, like, last year the Ethereum Foundation had the problem where like almost their entire research teams were being bankrolled by, LSTs
Yeah,
and staking protocols.
yeah, yeah,
And they were very open, they were doing that, and
yeah.
they were very forthcoming, and they were critical of them too. But is this a bribe? I don't know.
So yeah, so look, I think that I'm happy you mentioned that as an example. Um, Global currencies and global protocols will be harder to enforce, and they need to root in local communities. And when I say local communities, I don't mean just geographic. I just mean people who have regular high bandwidth communication with each other, and can hold each other accountable. But if everyone's attention is on global currencies and everybody's just trying to, gain influence through them, and they are the dominant way for influencing your environment, is just holding, whether it's a fiat currency or another kind of global currency or cryptocurrency. These are low bandwidth currencies, right? You don't know anybody who's participating in them. A few people, you don't even know everyone's state. Like, so it's just much harder to enforce bribery, and coercion. That being said, if you had, say, a rich network of community currencies, like let's take what happened to the Ethereum Foundation last year. Imagine everybody had a rich network of community currencies underneath them, right? That were, grounded in, interactions online and offline, and represented their communities, and they're fluid and permeable. And that's another nice aspects of community currencies. It's not binary. It's everything's on a spectrum. If like you had that, then say some global currency like the EF, what they could do is, stipulate your participation as a researcher in the Ethereum Foundation off disclosure of your community currencies, right? And be like, you have to disclose this. In the same way that when you raise money from an investor or something, you have to, or say you join a board, you have to disclose your conflicts of interest, right? So you're not like looting and stealing from your company or from your shareholders. They could stipulate that, right? And say you have to disclose this. And knowing the kind of constellation of each participant's like economic interests, in where they are embedded, in their communities and conversations and socially contextualized, you can actually just modulate the level of influence these folks have on decisions based off of their conflicts of interest. So, okay, a bunch of people have accepted payments from EigenLayer. Okay, we hear your voice, but we put a square root on your influence, right? And so the way to manage the conflicts of interest is to just not bar the revolving door, which is impossible, right? But to actually surface it and say, okay, now we're just, we're gonna, because you have this conflict, right? Because you're kind of clustered with this group, and say like Ethereum as a currency has like many groups, right? And they're all overlapping. And the question is which ones even matter and which don't, right? But you can just kind of cluster people by their stakes and kind of put a square root and treat, participants who are part of the same sets of communities or have high degrees of overlap, or in high degrees of overlapping economic state, and kind of treat them as one, right? And then you just sort of check their influence, and then you can surface decisions, proposals, research initiatives that are in the broader common good, by acknowledging these differences and just kind of correcting for their excesses. So, and on the short answer to your question is, on the one hand, global currencies are the hardest to police for collusion and bribery and coercion, whatever. But on the other hand, if you have a rich enough social layers, not just one, like, networks and subnetworks and so on, and communities, you can actually do really cool things to offset these biases and surface something that's less capturable and less likely to confer, some L2 or some competing group, an advantage in an ecosystem, which can cascade into, catastrophic risks. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems like the answer in most of these is like, you need a very active group of people who care about it, who are willing to do something about it. You know what I mean? Like an active social layer that's like just in there ready to make changes.
Well, we already have an active social layer. But
it's just not capable, I guess, is what you're saying?
Well, we just haven't expressed it. So right. We're all like social beings. We all are part of groups and communities. We have solidarities. We have fights. We have conflicts. You have communities. And even like informal. I think a lot of people, especially in crypto, because they're online so much, their community ends up being this kind of algorithmic cluster on X, right? Or something like that. Or some kind of current, you're a Bitcoin maxi or an ETH maxi or a Solana maxi, and then you get in those Telegram channels or whatever. Those are actually all communities with like different levels of bandwidth, right? Different levels of information richness. But everybody is, born to a family, right? Everybody lives somewhere on the planet, right? We have interactions with people online and offline, and to the extent you can express these communities, you can do just really cool things. You can actually enable communication in a much richer way to unlock new economic opportunities, and collaboration and cooperation. And we haven't talked about plural funding, but there's ways to even reimagine governance in a way that turns society into like a social innovation machine, where everybody's sort of picking up problems that are interesting, and they're kind of getting funded partially, they get solved, and then you don't get this sort of sclerotic, you get a real cool social dynamism between joining new communities, forming new communities, conflicts, cleavages, recombining, and it's just very dynamic and informationally rich, like a coral reef. There is a social layer. It's just that we haven't really expressed it. And because we haven't expressed it, we're in a very actually compressed information environment. And we're in a low bandwidth channel. We're in one, in crypto, in X. And, there are ways even within these platforms, like in the paper, I talk about corporate capture and corporate overreach, and how you end up hitting limits of economic growth even as a platform because you stop reaching new audiences, right? There are ways that even, these big social media companies can, by enabling the expression of communities and groups within them, you can augment and express a social layer, and with, of course, privacy preserving technologies and cryptography, enable like a very, dynamic social layer to emerge and form new ideas and recombine into new groups. And the stuff that gets, pushed out into the general commons outside of these like nested partial commons, the stuff that gets blasted out to the public ends up being a lot more interesting and a lot more useful and, useful, non-obvious, and innovative broadly than stuff when you don't enable the expression of groups and subgroups and enable them to have some kind of partial privacy in their conversations and that. So anyways, that's a little bit of rant on like how how companies can change social media, but yeah.
No, I mean, I guess my next comment would be on like part of what you were saying is that the more local you can have these things, the better, and you want more of the power to stay local, and you get some more expression that way. But it seems like my question would be is who on the local level is going to opt into these in that way? Like this to explain, like maybe this is like wrong history reading for me, but there's like the idea like, basically like there's a reason like we don't have current family currencies, right? Like if you had like, oh, like I changed a diaper, like you get $1, I did this, you get this, and you and your wife or husband were making sure everything was perfectly even and balanced, like that would be a pretty miserable marriage probably, right? Or maybe not, but to me it sounds like that would be pretty bad. Or like same with like some of the time currencies. I think about like, like, oh, like if you go and help your neighbor move a couch, like then he could give you some currency. And it's like, I don't actually want currency. I just want like the free time to go over and help my neighbor move the couch, right? Like, it's like, where does it sort of fit? Yeah.
Like I think it's because there's a lot of connotations with the word currency that you're importing into it.
Okay.
And we built a lot of like money systems that are just very sort of seems like, okay, like this is transactional. And so, we don't want to make civil society and family life transactional. I agree with you 100%. I don't think, I wouldn't expect like these experiments to take off in like families or things like that, right away. I think the currency part, first of all, it's serving an information function, and it's also transforming the nature of money, right, into a resource exchange across like shared goods. So it's not like it's more, PCARE, like just enabling a system that lets you build influence in the things that you care about, right, that are like relevant to you. And it's almost just like your own sort of attention mechanism as a human being. I care about a lot of things. How do I decide and how do I manage my time and my resources to like, figure out what matters to me most, and also like where I can do the most, and pick those low hanging fruit opportunities for things around me. I think this thing would, like Switzerland is a great, it's a country rich in subsidiarity. So this would be like a place that would be a great experimental ground for this, because people pay attention to local politics, and local politics has more influence, right, than the kind of federal politics. And that's also what makes Switzerland work so well, right? And it's like an example of like a very functional democratic state. And I would say a lot of the democratic states that are struggling are ones that have not been able to encode this subsidiarity, right? And a lot of the complaints, for example, what's happening in the United States right now, and like dismantling certain administrative agencies, like there's actually a philosophical movement behind that. It's not all reactionary. It's like, well, we want more federalism, we want more local power. We don't want the federal government to be doing all this stuff, and not everything should be solved at a federal level, right? So there's a the federalism and the subsidiary ideology is a real thing, and I subscribe to that too. I believe in federalism and subsidiarity, obviously. So community currencies can just be seen as a way to encode that into societies and enable them to just function more, efficiently between this kind of extreme of like quote unquote democratic governance and corporate governance to like something in between that is just more efficient. So like I wouldn't expect this to like I'm not going to like issue a community currency to my husband and be like, okay, like we're going to have an inflation rate and we've got like our family UBI
Right.
and whatever. But I
You get
think like,
10%, I get 90. This is
you know, yeah, like yeah, I'm not going to like deploy an AI agent on him or whatever,
yeah,
like my son and I form a coalition, right? But I think communities that have shared resources, right, and need to figure out like, do we spend more on education, on health, on culling the forest to prevent fires, or cleaning the lake, or paving the roads. Like these are really specific allocation problems, and I think we can do it much more intelligently than we're doing now, and in a way where money systems and voting systems don't necessarily conflict with each other to create capture and overreach, but actually kind of get resolved to the same unit of account and create a trade-off space between them. So it's like a radically like different view of money. And when you kind of like import your notions of what money is, then you're like, oh, like this could be transact, and but it's like, well, yeah, but except you're actually just what you're doing is you're enabling an expression of like a trade-off space that wasn't there before.
right. Yeah. So do you think Doge actually comes from a point of ideological integrity? Is this
Oh, I mean, that's a whole, I don't know. The question is who is in Doge, and like I'm sure there's all these kind of factions there and they've all got their different
right.
interests. But I'm saying in the
The local versus federal debate?
zooming out,
Yes, I agree.
because I'm a lawyer, um, and zooming out this kind of battle that's going on about remaking the administrative state, like which there are factions even within that, right? Some people subscribe to federalism, and then some people subscribe, want to dismantle the administrative state to centralize the power in an executive, right? That would not be federalism. That's a big faction as well, right? And so the question is you're kind of dismantling something, but what are you creating there? Are you creating tools of empowerment for local governance, or are you actually creating tools of surveillance and centralization? Um, in the age of AI, which is kind of scary. you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess with these things, so like let's say Switzerland did make this, we'll kind of go on this example. Just, you have each local government has their own currency and you can stake it to have influence, or you can trade it around. And then are there states in Switzerland? I don't even know. But say you have a federal one as well.
They're canton.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like each different level. And then apparently
Yeah.
there would probably be some sort of trade rate between the two. So like if you wanted
Oh, I
more
mean, yeah. I mean, there's like
federal
supply
power,
and
you trade it up.
yeah, there's supply and demand, and yeah, like this is a kind of plural good market mechanism, right?
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, how would it work? Yeah, it's interesting. Um, I think like, there's so many shared resources in Switzerland, around. I wouldn't start it. I'm a I like to test things first. I don't like to immediately go for the jugular, right? I wouldn't universalize this like right away. Maybe try to start with like some ski slopes and some like lakes and be like, okay, like let's see how this works here in a small subset in a community. Or like you can even do it with like uh, you know, churches as well. Like there's certain churches that are like decentralized, and going between different churches and You can do it with like music and creating communities around music and like test it there. Um, Open source research communities, and they're super interesting because uh, they they have a lot of status, but not a lot of money, right? And like academic communities uh, are kind of the opposite. Like, they have a lot of money, but not a lot of ways to represent status very well. And so those are, and then kind of creating an intersection between academic communities and like open source communities and letting them interoperate more flexibly to let them trade money and status. The open source communities need more of the status of the academic communities and vice versa. Well, actually, no, sorry, the other way around. But anyways, like there are ways where you can get groups of people that are interacting, that are not interacting, to get them to interact and exchange ideas and make new, groups that are more, that cross divides and bridge and enable more, innovative ideas to result.
Well, this was like, like that's one of the places I came from with the original community currency idea was like, I think back like the Bernard Lietaer type style, like you use like inflationary currencies in a way to, if you have underutilized resources, now you can have a community currency that can sort of spur them to do something. If you have a bunch of men sitting around on stoops doing nothing, we can bring in a community currency and it can spur them to do something. Or this was like the idea in 20 years ago. But it seems like this isn't necessarily about going after underutilized resources or like,
No, it totally is. Like
okay,
I love economic growth. I don't think we have enough of it.
okay,
I actually I'm like a very hard nosed, like we need more productivity and more economic growth. And
really?
I don't think we should, and we need better risk management. Like I don't like volatility and the world is becoming volatile and it's like unnecessary, right? So this is actually, I've thought pretty deeply about risk management, or at least I think I have. Um, Depends on which audience I'm talking to. I'm sure some people would be like, "This thing is going to blow up the world," but like, no. I mean, part of the so the community currency idea, I want to like give a different framing on it, and tie it back, ladder it back to the risk management question. Like, ultimately, there's two sides of power. There's information, there's control. And so I want to give you like my first principles thinking about power, because when you have too much power in a single point, that's when you get catastrophic risk. That's when things blow up, right? Um, and the intuition around information control, like a good example is like when you control a media channel, right? You can control the information that makes the participants in that media channel more informationally similar, which deepens your lever of control, you know, and then you can influence them with information more. And so it's a flywheel. The more information you control, the more control you have, and the more information you can control. And
Yeah.
they're two sides of the same coin, right? And state controlled media is an example of that. And the community currency model, when you are, say you receive your community-based income. And by the way, I'm against universal basic income, but I am for community-based income. Big distinction. When you receive your community-based income and you're deciding how much do I stake for influence versus how much do I keep as currency that I can use to exchange with other communities, what you're really doing is you're being presented with a trade-off between, do I get a deeper lever of control on this community, or do I keep this currency because I want new information and I want to interact with other communities? And so it's creating a trade-off between information and control. Whereas with current money systems, it buys both, right?
Right.
Um, and that's why you get these kind of oligopolistic market structures or Pareto outcomes, skewed outcomes.
But would
And
you
so
say that there's like if you're assuming that the only way to buy into the other currency is with that currency or no? Because
or
like,
with any And see, I mean, you have to find a willing seller. It's just a willing buyer and seller, right? Coincidence
Well,
of
but that's what I
wants.
mean. Like, usually this is a problem like with almost like savings in general. Like the wealthies tend to save more, right? So like it would be if if you have a ton of US dollars, of course I'm just going to stake 100% of this token. And then the other people who actually don't have a lot of US dollars are ending up spending it and don't necessarily get any of the um, say. Is that a
Which is
concern?
where we are today, right?
Yeah.
That's where we are
Yeah.
today. And so that's why I'm creating a new possibility space for community currencies to give groups of people who don't have, right now we are in that Pareto distribution, and it's just like a global currency war and just like a few actors and oligopolists that have just a disproportionate power. And when I say power, I mean not, information control or attention and influence, right? And so yeah, what community currencies do is they just empower groups to come together and say, okay, we're a group. If you want access to us, right, we control this resource, and like we're creating our own currency, and you're gonna have to find a willing buyer and a willing seller in a coincidence of wants, and that's how you push power back down. And even if each of these communities, there's two important points. Even if each community gets kind of captured by an elite, right? The recombination amongst them and the security, the security incentive. There's a strong security incentive for diversification. Um, that recombination of social groups will avoid a kind of skewed, Pareto distribution and push it more to a normal distribution of power. And that normal distribution of power is much better for risk management and much better for like collective intelligence and like figuring out, okay, how do we manage the risks of fire versus the risk of disease versus, all these kind of social broader problems that are not private and not public, right? But something in between. And how do you navigate that balance? So, you know, I don't. It's a response. It's a response to exactly to the problem that you're raising, and it's a response that actually, I think, mitigates risk and wrings out idiosyncratic risk uh, in communities individually through the enforcement mechanisms to leave us to actually help reveal what the systemic risks are and like let us solve for those systemic risks. And that's like a very kind of subtle and deep point, which I try to make like later in the paper when I talk about risk management. But I'm ultimately thinking about this in terms of like, information flows, communication, and like idiosyncratic risk and correlations. And like, I mean, applying basic corporate finance theory to communication theory is basically what it is, you know?
Sure. Uh, yeah, no, I guess, we've been at this for an hour. I don't know how hard of a stop you have, but um, just you know, to kind of go into a point of optimism, how do you see over the past, say, 10 years of crypto, we haven't had the best of success getting community currencies or even people buying things with crypto, right? The best we have is like the Coinbase debit card, which like market sells your crypto and converts it to dollars. Um,
Yeah.
what's the path forward? Is this the path forward to some leading change? Where's some optimism, I guess, in kind of creating some more community power?
I think we're in a legitimacy crisis, you know? It's just like everything is in a legitimacy crisis, right? Governments are, people think governments are illegitimate. They think there's like a deep cynicism, a deep nihilism that has like taken root, which is very destructive and not good. Um, and I think this is the start to a legitimate alternative that is a is computational. It leverages the strengths of cryptography. It leverages the strengths of AI, but also compensates for their weaknesses too. It's not an anti-technology solution. It's like actually leveraging technology to create something that is more pro-social, better risk management, and just like better positioned to like accelerate economic growth. Um, in a legitimate way. And I think like as this legitimacy crisis deepens, people are going, necessity is the mother of all inventions. So I'm just sort of anticipating, I don't know when, but people are just going to say, well, I feel disenfranchised by the system. How do I, take more, have more control, more influence over my life? And like local communities and as power centralizes, one of the things that happens is it becomes divorced and disconnected from communities, right? That they're supposed to serve. And like, um, the kind of early American Revolution around like the Tea Party was, taxation without representation, right? Just it was extraction. It was a grievance of extraction without benefit. And I think as that happens, people are going to be like, well, how, I want we want to let's just take control over what we can, and that's our local environments and our communities and the people around us, and build something that works and doesn't feel extractive and is legitimate. And this is just sort of a try this, and this is a way to do it in a way that does not end in like vigilante justice or majoritarianism. Either majoritarianism is in money or majoritarianism in votes, right? They're actually both, and they're kind of converging to the same majoritarianism today. And so, yeah, I think people will sort of wake up to these alternatives, and I think it will also help them communicate better and solve problems, because when you enable the expression of a community and you and have a currency with it, you can actually, and this is a good note to end on, you can build like neural networks that embed the structure of communication and social groups into them, which enables bridging and like context-rich communication and preserves and enriches language to make it far more expressive. And if you think about AI and like these kind of centralized models, there's a real risk that the models kind of poison themselves and we end up just speaking gibberish. And I don't know if you ever saw the movie Cloud Atlas, but like Tom Hanks is speaking gibberish in it. And I always wondered why was that? And I was like, oh, it's because basically it's like an centralized AI society that is like fed back itself in loops. And now people are speaking gibberish, and that's like a real risk with like centralized AI. And so this kind of, is it will help people communicate better and like manage their groups and self-regulate their groups in a bottom-up legitimate way. And when they're able to solve problems better, then it will just work. And the forest might be burning down right now, but I think this is kind of like seeds for something that can germinate into what's now kind of a monoculture, and like turn it into like a really cool, rainforest of different plants, animals, species, communicating in like a jungle of just cool stuff, which I can't even predict. You know, anyways.
That was super fun. Yeah, no, and I'll link the paper. Anywhere else you want to send people, or?
Yeah, you can link the paper. Anyone who wants to do experiments, I think again, like I'm always kind of cautious, but I also think there's experiments to do with social media here. That's like a really other good starting point. And yeah, I mean, crypto is kind of filled with all these AI agents, but they're really dystopic and like they're just, untethered from reality. And like, I don't understand what their point is. Are they really helping people? So if anyone wants to build AI agents that actually help people, and help groups solve problems and even defend themselves against like these, adversarial AIs, they're gonna like call up your grandmother and like, convince her all this stuff, that they're real and get her to, send her money, like we need to defend grandma. So if anyone wants to defend grandma, you can send me a message.
Perfect. Well, thank you. This was a blast.
Thank you.